So have you heard the one about the UU minister who went to hear an atheist lecture at a Christian music festival? No, you haven't heard this one? Well, I'm not surprised. You see, it's not actually a joke. It's what I did over my summer vacation last year. And obviously this was not your stereotypical Christian music festival. It was called the Wild Goose Festival. It was in central North Carolina, near where I lived at the time. And at that time last year, it was in its second year of offering a gathering of the tribes that make up the progressive wings of contemporary Christianity, especially the newly emerging progressive evangelical community. Performances by Christian musicians were interspersed with lectures and workshops by authors, theologians, and social justice activists. All of these are on the program together. Now, the vision statement of the festival says, "This festival is rooted in the Christian tradition and therefore open to all, regardless of belief, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, denomination, or religious affiliations." Pause for a minute and think about that. Because they are Christian, therefore they are open to every sexuality and religion. Now, I myself am a UU Christian, and it does me such a world of good to finally hear a major Christian gathering that is affirming such an openness after there has been so many occasions in which too many so-called Christians use the trappings of the religion to discriminate and to oppress. So, with such a unique and such a hopeful gathering, happening just an hour's drive away from my apartment, well, of course I was going to be there. And in fact, one of the focal points of last year's festival was interfaith dialogue. From their perspective, how Christians can respectfully engage with people of other faiths without trying to convert anyone. That's why they invited to speak at the festival Chris Stedman. Now, Chris Stedman is the assistant humanist chaplain at Harvard University. He and his associates write the blog Nonprofit Status. That's profit spelled P-R-O-P-H-E-T. Nonprofit Status. It describes itself as a forum for stories promoting atheist interfaith cooperation that hopes to catalyze a movement in which religious and secular folks not only coexist peacefully, but collaborate around shared values. This atheist inclusive interfaith collaboration was the subject of his presentation at Wild Goose, in which he advocated for the creation of what he called communities of compassion and respect. Communities in which people of different faiths and of no faith can meet to discuss their similarities and their differences openly and safely. So Stedman's talk did not fit the stereotype of an atheist lecture either. Rather than passionately arguing against the existence of God or against some other religion, as some atheists have done, Stedman showed real respect for them. And it was a real treat to see this kind of interfaith work advocated by Stedman and by the Wild Goose Festival really being lived out that weekend. Now, of course, our faith tradition, Unitarian Universalism, with its uniquely pluralistic approach to religious insight, has long valued the importance of such interfaith dialogue and cooperation. But valuing interfaith work and effectively engaging such work, not always the same thing. So what can such interfaith engagement mean for us? Where in this engagement must we Unitarian Universalists be careful not to go astray? And how does it benefit us and our neighbors to work directly with faith leaders and practitioners of many different religious traditions? Well, one obvious advantage of encountering people of other faiths is that it teaches us how to better relate to our neighbors, to those in our community of other faith perspectives. This was certainly true for me in my work several years ago as a hospital chaplain, serving for a year in a hospital in Bedford, actually, in one of the areas, like so many parts of the country, with a growing Muslim population at the time. And while I knew quite a bit academically, intellectually about Islam, I was relatively ignorant of the specific spiritual needs of the Muslim patients in the hospital until there was a presentation made to hospital staff by an imam, a Muslim prayer leader from the area, who explained, for example, that the water pitcher that I would occasionally see in the bathtub in the rooms of Muslim patients was there so that the patients could wash their feet before their prayers, the 5 daily prayers that were described in the children's story. Cleanliness being an important requirement for engaging in such prayers for Muslims. Also, that for patients who are bedridden, it is perfectly okay to pray in bed. It's only asked that the sheets be clean, again, cleanliness a requirement, and that the bed be turned or the patient's body turned so that they can face Mecca. This was an insight that gave me awareness of the needs of my neighbors, of those in the community that I served. Now, another benefit of dialogue with people of other faith traditions is that it equips us with perspectives to engage in interfaith cooperation in the larger community. The following year, after that hospital chaplaincy, I served my first interim ministry in San Antonio and had the chance to work closely with the community organizations, COPS and Metro Alliance, including participating in a clergy study group, which met monthly to study not only some of the issues of the day, but also that year was engaged in Bible study with the book of Micah, and was applying the teachings of the Jewish prophet Micah around issues of justice to the issues that were facing the community at that time in San Antonio. It was a rich opportunity for me to learn not only where so many of my fellow clergy, the majority of whom were Catholic priests, not only where they stood on specific local issues, but why. What it was within their own faith, their own theological perspectives, that influenced them to hold such views. And it was an opening for a richer dialogue, not only about what issues were important, but how we could engage them together from our differing faith perspectives. Now, there's something else we gain from genuine, deep interfaith dialogue. We come to a deeper appreciation and a deeper understanding of our own faith tradition. This point is a little more subtle than the others, perhaps, but it's no less true. During my seminary days, I had an opportunity to participate in a gathering of seminarians from different faith traditions, Christian and Jewish seminary students, gathered for a few days. The subject was teaching a difficult text, that is, exploring biblical texts that dealt with issues of gender, sexual orientation, and those that were used to justify anti-Jewish biases as well. There was some tough conversation between the conservative and the liberal students, between the Jewish and Christian students, certainly. But it was also an opportunity that frankly forced me to find new ways to explain my perspective and the Unitarian Universalist perspective on Scripture, as well as on our affirmation of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, our views on women's equality, and yes, our perspectives on interfaith relations as well. By being forced to speak from my views on these subjects, I gained a better insight, a deeper insight into those views. So clearly there are many benefits to this kind of interfaith dialogue, but there's also a potential for respect to be abandoned, a potential for offense to be taken. So one of the traps to avoid, frankly, it's one that's particularly risky for us Unitarian Universalists when we engage in this kind of interfaith dialogue, and that's the danger of picking and choosing our own religious practices and beliefs from other traditions without regard to the deeper meaning that such beliefs and practices hold in the traditions from which they grew out of. That's the spiritual window shopping that Rumi warns us against in the reading we heard earlier. And we can make the mistake of casually sampling some spiritual trinkets that may please the mind, but not impart the spiritual depth to be found in their traditions of origin. And it also conveys the implicit message that your reason for engaging in interfaith dialogue is to see what you can get out of it in your own spiritual life. I'll give you an example. Let's say you were to encounter a member of the Lakota Sioux tribe, and you spent your entire time in conversation together asking about sweat lodges, because you've always wanted to experience that. Well, you may think that you're showing respect for Lakota ways, but you might look more like you want to use this Lakota practice for your own gain, and that Native American person you're speaking with may not feel very respected. Plus, these surface engagements with religious practices do little to feed one's own soul. Now, this gets at another tendency, a potentially harmful one, that some people new to interfaith dialogue find appealing. It's the tendency to assume that every religion says the same thing, that there is no difference between them. Again, this often feels respectful to the person who's saying it, but all religions have profound similarities and real differences from each other. To focus only on the similarities between your faith and another's in a way that ignores these differences is not to see the other tradition in its fullness. It's not to see your own tradition in its fullness either. Maybe this is less mean-spirited than those intolerant people who claim the sole truth of their religion by highlighting only its differences with some other faith. But both approaches, naming only the differences or naming only the similarities, is inherently partial and therefore misleading. Now, we saw both extremes in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. There were intolerant Christians who rushed to condemn and seek revenge against all Muslims because of the handful of intolerant Muslims who committed the attacks, while tolerant Muslims and tolerant Christians and Jews, Unitarian Universalists, etc., sometimes defensively rushed in and simplistically proclaimed the beliefs we all held in common. But the most balanced and nuanced statement I heard came from a rabbi, Rabbi Jeffrey Dennis. He serves Congregation Koami in Flower Mound. And he spoke the weekend after the September 11th attacks at a nearby mosque at an interfaith gathering that they hosted. Rabbi Dennis was clear to note that his Jewish tradition and the Islamic tradition of those from the mosque were in the same family of religions, but not the same religion. There were important differences between them that should not be ignored, he said, but he was also quick to add, this was a time for focusing on the commonalities. And he went on to affirm the monotheism that was central, both to faithful Muslims and to faithful Jews. Rabbi Dennis walked this fine line of emphasizing the similarities between Judaism and Islam without ignoring that they each had distinctive qualities. Now, there's one other thing I can say about healthy and respectful interfaith dialogue. And this one's not so much a danger, nor so much a benefit, but just an important reminder for us always to keep in mind. And it can be summed up in two words. Be humble. Be humble. Too few of us are experts in our own faith, much less someone else's faith tradition. Let's not pretend to be. Because when we affirm our own limited knowledge, we can open up the door for trusting one another and for feeling emotionally safe to share both the similarities and the differences. It's that openness and trust, especially when fueled by humility, that is a vital ingredient for creating those communities of compassion and respect that Chris Stedman advocated for last summer. And that brings me back to the Wild Goose Festival. You may have been wondering how even these more progressive Christians received this talk from an avowed atheist. Well, quite well, I'm pleased to report. There was a large audience, there was warm applause, and the Q&A session afterwards was quite respectful. Now, there was one moment that gave me pause during the Q&A. It referred back to Chris having begun his talk with his own story of having spent his middle school and high school years as an evangelical Christian, but having been rejected by those communities. First, when in high school he came out as gay, and then second, in his freshman year of college, when he came to realize that he did not believe the doctrines of God, heaven, or salvation that those churches taught. One man in the audience later stood up and said, "I'm one of those evangelical Christians, like the ones you knew as a young man." And I thought, uh-oh, is it time for a confrontation here? But no, I was wrong. He went on to say, "On behalf of my fellow evangelicals, I want to apologize to you and to other atheists who we evangelicals have rejected and mistreated. It was not fair to you. It was not true what we believe, and I am truly sorry." That humility from an evangelical Christian to an atheist was an opening. It was not a disrespectful picking and choosing of what beliefs and practices to uphold, nor was it some naive moment of ignoring the differences between the two men. But it was a moment upon which trust could be built, and a moment for engaging in sincere, open, and respectful dialogue. When we avoid pitfalls like these, then we see the benefits of interfaith dialogue, that we can relate better to our neighbors, to those in our community with other faith perspectives. We can equip ourselves to engage in interfaith cooperation in the larger community, to see how we can work together for the common good. And we come to a deeper understanding and a deeper appreciation of our own faith as Unitarian Universalists, as people who affirm covenants over creeds, and as people who stand on the side of love. So in our engagements with people of varying faith traditions in our lives in the days to come, may it be so for all of us. Amen. I invite you to rise in body or spirit and join together in singing our closing hymn. It's number 347, number 347. Sing your great hymnal, Gather the Spirit. Please rise.